Okay, the argument I made earlier is that the politics of the ulama were separate from the politics of the government. In essence, the separation of a non-existing church and state was the order of things in Muslim societies. Now, concordance was incidental and not necessarily obligatory. That is, if for some reason the ulama and the politicians were reading from the same page or were in agreement on certain issues, it was. But there were cases where they differed, and each followed their own orders. And Muslim scholars and theologians consistently rejected theocracy as a matter of principle, as well as its impracticability. And the impracticability part of it comes from the fact that in the Muslim society, simultaneously, different fiqh schools, or the schools of jurisprudence, were allowed to operate side by side. So in a particular city in the Muslim society, you could have had Hanafi scholars dominate one portion of, or one part of the city, and Shafis in another, and Jafaris in a different. And so therefore there was no such a thing as a state religion. And so not having a one state religion then made it impractical for that one to be coerced into it. And in fact, we know of stories such as the jurist Abu Hanifa, who willingly faced the consequence of jail and torture for turning down the caliph's suggestion that was to make only his version of the jurisprudence that of the entire state of the Abbasids. And anyone would have jumped at the opportunity, but not Abu Hanifa. He said, my worth and measure is in respect to my competitor theologians, where my arguments, when they are compared with others and they get more adherents, it's because there is certain value in it. There is certain validity in an argument. If you make my jurisprudence, or my version of the interpretations of the exegesis of the Quran and the Sunnah, then I become a mouthpiece of your empire, and I lose all my credibility as a scholar, and I don't want that. And they jailed him, but he wouldn't give in. And of course, he wasn't the only one. There were several others who did pretty much the same thing. And therefore, one of the reasons that theocracies did not develop in the Muslim world was this resistance by the ulama, by the religious scholars, who did not allow any co-optation into the political process. Let's make this a bit more case specific. We have Al-Mawardi, the first political scientist in Islam, who did not see any incompatibility in bringing religion norms into politics, and he took the necessary steps in preventing the formation of theocracy in the Muslim world. And in his famous work, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the ordinance of the government, Al-Mawardi discusses various aspects of the Islamic constitutional system. In other words, I'm putting a seal of approval on the thoughts I shared with you, that this is not just a hearsay, not an interpretation, not an impression of my understanding of history, but there is scholarship to support the argument. So Al-Mawardi, he discusses various aspects of the Islamic constitutional system, and in his recently discovered work, which is the Tasheel al-Nadhar wa Ta'jeel al-Dhafar, if I'm reading the transliteration of it correctly, which is facilitating administration and accelerating victory. They had to rhyme. A little bit of poetic nuance wasn't bad at the time. That he sets in motion what may be considered as the concept of checks and balances, which we normally here contribute or attribute to the American Constitution, that Americans came up with the concept of the checks and balances. But no, that notion had existed, had been applied and tested in the Muslim world long before. To this, he introduces the third leg of the triad and balances the power once again by establishing the prominence of the electorate over the ruler. In other words, the rulership, when we are talking about the concept of a pyramid of power authority initiated from the top and distributed downward. In that one, there is a concept of reciprocity that is created. And Al-Mawardi believes that religion is the major element that leads to social cohesion, which in turn leads to political power. He does not entertain in any way a theory of divine rights of king, which is very, very critical. He does not entertain the divine rights of king. And if anything, that sort of nailed the argument of attributing either divinity or power to a ruler in the name of any religion. This is what did it. And in his view, the ruler is needed to protect religion, but he is not a God-appointed person. Therefore, the authority is different. The function is different. And he has to be chosen by the people, which is the concept of modern republic, or the way we elect rulers, probably with not the same degree of corruption, where money speaks louder than votes. But regardless of that, and he is only their mandub, their deputy. So again, the concept of a president, which in the European arena, they found it kind of unusual, and they didn't know how to deal with it when Americans came up with the concept of a president instead of a king. And it took time for the Europeans to accept this concept, that rulership could be one of a deputy of the people. So in principle, of course, in the American Constitution too, when we talk about we the people, then the source of legitimacy is with the people, not with the person at the helm. Al-Mawardi's work inspired Ibn Khaldun, who in his own right became the first social scientist. And again, from a Eurocentric point of view, the rest of the world haven't done a thing except that it was the European thought and the European democracy, and everything is Eurocentric. But as I said, Al-Mawardi would qualify as the first political scientist. A field or a let's see, how else should I describe? Yeah, a field of an academic field or an academic profession that did not emerge in Europe for centuries. And the same thing goes for Ibn Khaldun as a social scientist. And he advocated that any Sharia law that people make fuss about these days must protect an individual's right to the free exercise of religion, life, intellect, and reason, progeny, and property. So therefore, when we are talking about the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, that is already stated there. The exercise of religion, life, intellect, which is a problem, which is an issue that we have problem with now with the intellectual theft in terms of what's happening in China and the rest. And reason, that's your freedom of speech, whether expressed, written, voiced, or in any other way. That is guaranteed. And progeny, that is the right for you to own and to inherit property, whether it's material or otherwise. And so therefore the essence of the International Human Bill of Rights were already laid out. Muslims perceive the theocracies of European Christendom as a Christian thing. That's a concept in the idea of cultural relativism. From their point of view, when they call this theocracy as a Christian thing, they looked down upon it, that only Christians wanted to create religious states, and how things have changed. And so this was a Christian thing of the Dark Ages for which there was no counterpart, such as Islamdom. So Christendom was a European Christian concept, where the word itself implied a religion and a church and state entity by its very definition. But there was no such a thing as Islamdom to be its equivalent. However, because that is the way the Christian European thought was to be understood, then out of that necessity, they called the other side in the Muslim society Muslimdom or Islamdom, which is, like I said, only a projection of their own political thinking on the Muslim society. we could also go to the idea of the compatibility of reason and revelation. Again, both in the Greek thought and subsequently in the Roman and then later the Christian European thought, that was incompatible. Reason and revelation could never work together. But Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as his name is Latinized, he introduced to the Europeans that concept. That was the norm for the Muslims, and it was an exception to the European thinkers to think that that would be even possible. So the only person who became that exception in Europe was Thomas Aquinas, or we could also add Moses Maimonides. These were the only non-Muslim Europeans who were convinced by the thought of Ibn Rushd that yes, reason and revelation can be compatible. The Muslims enhanced, refined, and sustained the concept of political pluralism in a more comprehensive and inclusive system of government, while the exclusionist European system eventually exited the political arena via theocratic suppression to a secularism that rings hollow, empty of spiritual wholeness. So it's going back to that concept of either or, because the Europeans didn't see the two, reason and revelation, as compatible. Then at one point they were all religious state institutions, and at another they were all secular. So we had the Roman Empire until the year 418, when it collapsed and the Christians took over, Christian Catholicism. Then they simply fill the posts that were held by the Romans. When you're talking about a Christian minister, this was a minister, like in a state government, for instance. And so, therefore, the secular or Romans were gone. The Christian Catholics came and filled the gaps and the structure and the pyramid of political power in Rome, and therefore Roman Catholicism became similar to Roman Empire, as the name implies. And this continued until the Age of Enlightenment, when secularism swept across Europe, and therefore now the religious authorities, the role of the church and all that had to be pushed aside in order for the secularists to come and take over. And I think that clearly explains how the concept of the either or between reason and revelation in European thought has worked for centuries. And it's that European thinking, that European mindset, which just does not understand how other societies could manage and could see the compatibility between reason and revelation. And yes, many Muslim societies too feel obligated, as a matter of adhering to the forces of modernity or the necessity of time or something that is fashionable, and therefore they either create dictatorships or they create quote-unquote Islamic states, and they're both on the wrong. Because when they create dictatorships where a religion doesn't have a role to play, they are following the European model, but at the same time they are rejected by their own people. And when they declare these as Islamic republics of the various types, again, they become Islamic in name, but they act as though these would be theocracies, or at least the Europeans think of them as theocracies, and therefore Europeans show their own resentment to any state that has the word Islamic in it, whether it's the ISIS or which is the Islamic Republic of Iran or any other for that matter. The concept of that spiritual, the empty, that the European thought or the European system was empty of political or rather spiritual wholeness is along the line of that either-or concept. The next argument is that an Islamic state by definition implies the establishment of a state, including all its branches, in accordance with a defined set of religious ideological principles. This would be a theocracy. So a theocracy is a Christian thing, as we talked about, but it is un-Islamic. A theocracy, or an Islamic government, if we want to call it that, an Islamic government is un-Islamic for the following reasons. 1, that all citizens of the state would be obligated to adhere to the laws of one religion. Number 2, forcing other faith communities to Islamic laws constitute compulsion in matters of faith that is strictly prohibited in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 156, or it might be 256. Therefore, establishing an Islamic state in an is un-Islamic as a political monopolistic entity, not too different from communism. Anywhere where there is an imposition of an ideology, even if it's a religious ideology, it is not democracy. Now, this is precisely where the Islamic Republic of Iran faces problems with its religious minorities, such as the Jewish, and similarly like the Jewish state of Israel, that has often been referred to as the state of religious apartheid. So we have enough examples in our modern times too, that you declare a state in the name of a religion, a theocracy. It doesn't matter whether you favor them or disfavor them. But if Israel is a Jewish state and Iran is an Islamic state, we can clearly see that they have problem with their religious minorities who fall out of favor of the majority in the legal context. And Abdul Karim Soroush discusses this issue by arguing that no understanding of Islam can offer a detailed and effective blueprint for the foundation and administration of any form of religious government, democracy included. It is wrong, he maintains, to judge the religious nature of a state based on the degree to which its institutions reflect some aspect of religion. The institutional role of religion in government is at best limited to the establishment of a legal code that incorporates its congruent parts, which is the fiqh. So the argument that Soroush makes is that yes, you could make certain laws, legal codes, but you cannot impose that in the name of religion per se. So therefore, theocracy, no. But laws and legal codes that may have roots in any particular religion, and in this case Islam, that would be okay, so long as it does not make that distinction on the believers of other faith communities. We have another argument. This is offered by Usman bin Bakar, who argues for the wider and comprehensive scope of Sharia in respect to its guarantees of religious freedom. he writes, Islam recognizes the collective rights of all religious communities to exist and their equality before law. The Quran prescribes religious freedom and pluralism, and he is quoting Quran chapter or Surah 109, verses 1 through 6, that for a healthy competition in various human societies, Islam does not restrict itself to providing merely a theological and philosophical framework for thinking about pluralism. Islam also provides a legal framework, the Sharia, for the concrete practical realization of it in society and the regulation of its societal expression in the interest of the common good. And so therefore you hear it from the different angles, different perspectives of different fiqh scholars in the Muslim world that says that so long as there is a recognition of the collective religious rights of all communities, that principle alone stands in contradiction to anything that you may want to label as an Islamic state. From a theosophical standpoint, theocracy considers sovereignty as the sole domain of the divine, while secular democracy assigns that right exclusively to the people, we the people. Islamic governance reconciles this either or prerogative by recognizing the supremacy of hakimiyya. We talked about this in an earlier program too. The supremacy of the hakimiyya, or the divine sovereignty, as it is assigned, as it assigns khilafah, or popular vicegerency, to humanity. So there is that key distinction, and this, of course, is based on the Quran, chapter 7, verse 54, chapter 12, verse 40, chapter 24, verse 55, and chapter 4, verse 105, for those of you who would be interested in exploring this further for your own scholarship, is that we have to make that distinction of hakimiyya and khilafah, or istikhlaf. That, like I said, we discussed this before too. With that distinction, or rather, let's put it this way, there are people who do not make this distinction. And so because they think that God Almighty is the Al-Hakim, the sovereign, the sovereignty stays with God, therefore that makes a government also an Islamic government. Not so. And it was this concept of istikhlaf that was practiced in Medina when we had the first, second, third Khalifa and the rest. So Khilafah is different than Hakimiyya, or the sovereignty. Sovereignty and vicegerency are not the same. And so in a way, when, say, the US Constitution says we the people, and if that is expressing in a sense the concept of the vicegerency, they may not use the religious terms, but in reality the sovereignty is with the people in that case. That is where the problem comes, is that sovereignty, a Muslim would say, or an Islamic scholar would say, belongs to God. And that's because in the West they don't make the distinction. Now, here's a quotation that specifically states this in the Quran, that we have sent you the book in truth, that you, O Prophet, might judge between men as guided by Allah. Men guided by Allah. So men is the vicegerency, and Allah, of course, is the sovereignty. This is Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 105. Thus, while literally, as in the state of the caliphal city-state of Medina, Khilafah, or the Caliph, is perceived as the political successor to the Prophet. Successor. not a replacement in any other way. Now, in general, all humanity, as the attributive of the archetypal Adam, they imply to be, in that sense, Khalifa. So we're all Khalifas in our affairs. And the Khilafah in the state of, in the case of governance, is only in reference to a political power. So Allah has promised to those among you who believe and work righteous deeds that He will assuredly make them succeed, those who rule, and grant them vicegerency in the land, just as He made those before them succeed. This is Surah An-Nur 24, Ayat 25. So therefore, again, it is not misconstruing verses of the Quran to make an argument, but referring to the exact verses in the most literal way, so we can understand them literally, but with clear implications as to how they would apply to people's life, and therefore an Islamic state would not be an Islamic idea. Let's take a short break and we will continue the discussion after the break.